faint whisper from a forgotten archive stirs in the shadows, a secret lost in smoke and silence, threatening to unravel lives and rewrite history. Beneath layers of fireproof walls and whispered lies, a truth lies hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was on one of those damp, formless afternoons of February, when London sulks beneath a veil of yellow-grey fog, that I found Holmes at his most impenetrable. The hearth at Baker Street crackled dutifully, but it had done little to stir him from the armchair where he sat, long limbs crossed, eyes closed, the tips of his fingers pressed in silent counsel beneath his chin. Upon the side table lay a half-finished breakfast, a Turkish cigarette burnt to a thread and a torn cipher, inked in crimson, that had failed to divert him. There was a density to his silence I'd come to recognise. It was not boredom, but the sharpening of something keener than restlessness, anticipation. The knock, when it came, was hesitant, not uncertain, but delayed, as if the visitor had stood for some time before daring the brass. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, stooped figure, wrapped in a library-smelling overcoat, and carrying the unmistakable odour of smoke. The man's eyes flitted toward the curtained window with the air of one not merely watched, but hunted by his own memory. Holmes opened one eye and gestured silently to the chair across from him. I noticed how the stranger's hands, long, ink-stained, trembled slightly as he removed his gloves. There was a nervous energy to him, like a man who had held too many secrets too tightly, and found one had slipped through his fingers. Holmes, without rising, let his gaze drift lazily over the man's attire. The overcoat was lined with faint chalk dust along the hem, not the dark soot of the London streets, but the softer residue of old stone. A brass button near the pocket bore a peculiar pitting, as though partially melted by heat. The left cuff showed a smear of ink not uncommon in scholars, yet shaped oddly, not brushed, but circular, as if from the pressing of a seal. Holmes said nothing at first, but I saw his eyes sharpen imperceptibly, taking in not just the man's words, but his silences. "You are recently returned from Bloomsbury," Holmes murmured at last, "though not from your usual post. The air of manuscript is upon you, but you have spent the last 2 nights in rooms not your own, possibly the Stafford Arms, judging by the starch of that collar." The man blinked. I confess, so did I. "Your business," Holmes continued, "concerns not the loss of a volume, but of a catalogue, one which was never meant to be read by the public." The visitor looked as though Holmes had not merely read his thoughts, but turned the page and begun the next chapter. "My name," the man said at last, voice low, "is Thaddeus Prentice. I am, or was, the chief archivist of the Langdale Athenaeum." His hands clenched. "A week ago, the index, the private index, not the official catalogue, was destroyed, not misplaced, burned. I awoke to find it smouldering in my own fireplace, and I do not recall how it came there." His eyes searched ours with a mixture of shame and dread. "It was never meant to be seen, but someone has seen it." Holmes leaned forward slightly, the tips of his fingers tapping once against his lips. "And yet you wear no trace of soot upon your skin, Mr. Prentice," he said softly. "Only the memory of fire." I felt the air change. The fog outside pressed against the windows, but here, in the room, something had awakened. The match had been struck, not to ignite, but to illuminate, and I knew from experience that Holmes had already glimpsed the shape of the flame behind the smoke. "My name is Thaddeus Prentice," said our visitor at last, his voice tremulous but not weak. "I have served for nearly 17 years as chief archivist of the Langdale Athenaeum." Holmes offered no response beyond the faintest tilt of his head, but I saw in his eyes the quiet sharpening of interest, that stillness which, in my experience, meant a storm of thought beneath the surface. Prentice clasped his hands tightly together. His fingers were long, with stains of ink along the sides and beneath the nails. Unmistakable evidence of a man who handled more manuscripts than meals. Yet there was something restless about him. He reminded me, oddly, of an overwound watch, precise, wound tight, and at risk of snapping. "You must forgive the state in which I arrived, gentlemen. I have slept little. In truth, I am not certain whether I have slept at all these past 3 nights." "You are forgiven," Holmes said mildly. "Though you may find, Mr. Prentice, that truth, unlike sleep, tends to return in fragments before it forms a whole." The man's lips parted, as if to reply, but he merely nodded, eyes fixed upon the rug as though afraid of where the truth might lead him. "There exists," Prentice said, "within the Langdale Athenaeum a second catalogue, unofficial, unpublished, a private index known only to myself and to the late curator, Mr. Hadlow. It was never spoken of in committee, and certainly never referenced aloud in the ledgers." Holmes's fingers steepled once more, but his gaze remained unmoving. "This index," the man continued, "was not concerned with the usual cataloguing of folios and first editions. It was a registry, a log of provenance, who gave what, when, and most dangerously, why." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, but he gave no sign of surprise. "Letters," Prentice went on, "diaries, military communications, memoirs never meant for daylight. Some were deposited under the guise of donation, others out of guilt or blackmail. There are materials within that collection which, if exposed, would tear through Parliament, through the peerage, like a fever. And it was kept," Holmes said softly, "in your sole custody." "Yes," Prentice said, "in a fireproof drawer beneath my desk, locked, hidden even from my assistants. No one, not even Lady Cresswell, chair of the trustees, knew of its full extent." "Then," Holmes murmured, "we may deduce with confidence who wished to know." Prentice's voice faltered then, and he removed a handkerchief from his coat pocket. Unused, I noticed, save for a faint smear of ash in one corner. "3 mornings ago, I awoke in my lodging to find smoke trailing beneath the parlour door. I assumed in a state of panic that the fireplace had been left open." He hesitated. It had not. He looked up at us, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. In the hearth lay the index, or what remained of it, pages blackened beyond legibility, some still smouldering at the edges. I extinguished them with the poker, but the ink had already fled. I could not help but lean forward. And the fireproof drawer? Still locked, Dr. Watson, still cold. The index had been removed without any visible tampering. There were no signs of forced entry to my rooms. I scarcely recall retiring the night before. There was a moment, a flash, perhaps, of someone at the threshold, but no memory follows. Holmes remained still, but there was a tightness to his mouth I knew well. "So," he said at last, "the fireproof steel protected its secrets, but someone removed them first, and left you with the ash." "I have not touched laudanum in years," Prentice said suddenly, as though to no one in particular. "Not since my student days, and yet I cannot account for nearly 8 hours of that evening. No dreams, no interruption, only the scent of smoke and the soft crackle of paper when I awoke." Holmes nodded slowly. "There are many ways to turn a mind against itself, Mr. Prentice. Drugs, yes, but also suggestion, shame, sleep deprivation. A man convinced he is losing grip may become a weapon in his own undoing." "I would not do such a thing," Prentice whispered. "I believe you." He looked up sharply, which is precisely why someone else went to great effort to ensure that you, and only you, would seem capable of it. Holmes stood and poured him a measure of brandy. "Drink this. We shall examine the ruins later. For now, let us attend to what was not burned." Holmes circled behind our guest, with the absent air of a man observing a particularly unusual postage stamp. "You are right-handed," he said suddenly, "yet the ink mark on your left cuff lies on the inner seam. Curious. Prentice looked down at his sleeve, startled. "And here," Holmes continued, pointing to the heel of the man's boot, "a fine residue of chalk, not the industrial black of the London streets, but soft white, academic, from stone steps perhaps, or a reading room under renovation." "Bloomsbury," Prentice offered. "The Athenaeum's east wing is being repaired." "Just so," Holmes nodded. "And this," he plucked gently at the edge of Prentice's overcoat, "a single brass button, pitted as if exposed to a chemical flame, a rare condition for someone who merely watched paper burn." I watched as Holmes returned to his seat, his gaze sharpening. "One final point. This ring-shaped blot of ink on your waistcoat, not smudged, but imprinted, either a stamp or, more likely, the absence of one." "My signet," Prentice said. "I lost it the day before the fire. I assumed it was—" "No," Holmes said. "It was taken. And now, I believe, we must ask ourselves, who took it and why?" There was a long pause then, filled only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Prentice swallowed hard. "I had assumed I misplaced it in some absent-minded moment." "Men do not misplace heirlooms, Mr. Prentice," Holmes replied. "They are relieved of them, and often not without purpose." The archivist hesitated. "It belonged to my grandfather, a custom piece, unmistakable to anyone who had seen it." "Which means it could be used," Holmes said evenly, "to authenticate documents or forgeries." Prentice stiffened, but did not deny it. "I did not think. You did not want to think," Holmes corrected. "Quite understandable." He leaned forward once more, fingertips pressed together. "There is something you have not told us. Not a lie, but an omission. I do not believe it was born of deceit, but of dread." Prentice closed his eyes. "There is someone at the Athenaeum," he whispered. "Someone I once trusted, but no longer can." The following morning, under a grey drizzle that clung to the windows like a second skin, Holmes and I made our way to Bloomsbury and the venerable Langdale Athenaeum. The Athenaeum stood with the solemn dignity of institutions that had once mattered more than Parliament, and still believed they might again. Its arched entrance bore the dust of 100 scholarly years, and the scent within was unmistakable, a mingling of waxed wood, ancient paper, and something subtler still, the pride of knowing secrets not meant for common ears. The librarian at the front desk offered us a nervous welcome, having been informed in advance of our visit. Holmes gave only the briefest of acknowledgements before striding past toward the private study room of the chief archivist. I followed with some difficulty, for his pace always quickened in the presence of mystery. The silence inside the Athenaeum was more than architectural. It was cultivated. One could imagine entire scandals growing old in the dark corners between shelves. Holmes paused beside a bookstand shaped like a griffin's claw and let his gloved hand rest briefly on the wood. "Institutions like this," he murmured, "are always more afraid of memory than of fire." The private study of the late Mr. Hadlow, now Mr. Prentice's sanctum, was a high-ceilinged chamber lined with cabinets and manuscripts encased in glass. In one corner stood a small desk, unremarkable save for the polished brass handles and the singular drawer that had been pried open with clinical precision. The charring around its edges was oddly contained, as though the fire had respected its assignment and gone no further. Holmes crouched before the drawer and removed a small magnifying lens from his pocket. He examined the metal clasp, the charred wood grain, and a fine residue clinging to the inner lip. "Not coal dust," he said softly. "Phosphorus compound, more likely. Clean burn, high temperature, controlled." He looked up at me. This was no act of panic. It was surgery. I stood a little behind him, struck by how untouched the rest of the study remained. A globe, half spun, still pointed north. A shelf of untouched folios bore no sign of smoke. "Not even an attempt to disguise the intention," I said. "Indeed," Holmes replied. because the act was never meant to hide the theft, only to suggest the guilt of the man who discovered it. At Holmes's instruction, the head assistant retrieved a ledger from the secure return desk, a thick hand-bound volume in which all item movements were recorded. It was, by its very nature, tedious, the sort of documentation only archivists and Sherlock Holmes could read with relish. He turned the pages carefully, one gloved finger tracing down the columns, until he paused at an entry dated 2 nights before the fire. "Here," he said, "a return recorded in Mr. Prentice's own hand, or so it would appear." He handed me the volume. The entry was in a script that bore all the visual hallmarks of Prentice's writing, the slanted F, the looping G, even the curious flourish on the lowercase r. And yet, Holmes tapped the margin beside it. "Note the pressure," he said. "Too deliberate, as though one were not writing, but copying." I looked up at him. "A forgery?" "An excellent one, but yes, most certainly." "But who would risk forging a simple ledger?" Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Someone who required plausible evidence of Mr. Prentice's presence in this room, when in fact, he was not." I felt a chill. Holmes's voice lowered. "The theft began long before the fire. The interviews with the junior librarians yielded little, or rather, yielded too little, and in precisely the wrong tone. The first was a pale fellow named Cray, who answered our questions with all the caution of a man balancing porcelain in a gale. The second, a red-haired woman named Miss Durning, had a sharper manner, and an aversion to eye contact whenever Mr. Prentice's name was mentioned. Holmes asked few direct questions. Instead, he stood with arms folded, watching the small shifts in voice, posture, and the glances pass too quickly to be innocent. "The chief archivist," Cray said nervously, "has been diligent, very diligent. Some would say, but of course I would not, that he was overly protective of the older acquisitions." Miss Durning's lips pressed thin. "There were rumours," she said after a pause. "But rumours mean little in a place built on secrets." Holmes gave no reaction, but I saw the slight narrowing of his eyes. Later, in the staff corridor, Holmes turned to me and said, "Resentment is the quietest of motives, Watson. It does not announce itself. It simmers and boils, only if stirred or weaponized." He stopped short as the night porter approached, eyes downcast. "Sir," he said, "there's something you ought to see." The night porter led us to a modest annex where tea was sometimes served to visiting scholars. He closed the door with a quiet precision and lowered his voice. "There's talk," he said, not meeting Holmes' eye. "Not from me, sir, but among the younger clerks, and some of the older ones too, if truth be told." "What kind of talk?" Holmes asked. "That there's more kept in the Langdalthans listed in the register, a collection behind the collection. No call numbers, no bindings, just letters, private things." Holmes nodded slowly. "Things that should not exist. They say Mr. Prentice had a key," the porter whispered, "that he catalogued the other things, letters from peers, soldiers, men who wrote things during the war they later regretted, women who had dealings." He glanced at me uneasily. "One of the lads said he saw a sealed packet once, marked Yardley correspondence." Holmes's expression did not change, but I recognized the flicker behind his eyes, the mental pencil circling a date in red. "If such a collection did exist," Holmes said, "what would be the Athenaeum's greatest fear?" The porter hesitated, then answered in a whisper, "That someone still knows what's inside." We had barely returned to the main hall when Holmes made a remark that caught me off guard. "Lady Cresswell will not be pleased by our inquiries," he said absently, as he straightened a volume of parliamentary acts. "She is not a suspect?" I asked. "Not of arson," he replied, "but of obstruction, certainly. She holds the chair of the trustees and regards scandal as a personal affront to order. Mr. Prentice's recent movements, especially the resurrection of the sub-index, would not have earned her favour. Do you think she knows what was taken? I think, Holmes replied, that she knows what could have been taken, and that, for her, is enough. I had never met Lady Cresswell, but Holmes's tone carried a kind of intellectual respect one rarely heard, usually reserved for those too dangerous to underestimate. She has weathered 4 governments and 3 chancellors, he added. One more librarian would not trouble her conscience. As Holmes returned to Prentice's study, he halted suddenly and crouched beside the desk. Curious, he murmured. I leaned closer and saw him retrieve a single thread. Red, fine, and no longer than a fingernail, caught where the desk leg met the rug. Silk, he said. Torn recently, military in origin. How can you be sure? Holmes held it beneath his nose and smiled faintly. Because it carries parfum d'amance, a French scent last produced in 1887 and discontinued shortly after, not available in England through reputable vendors. I looked at him, puzzled. A woman, he said, was here recently, in uniform or bearing one, likely a disguise, and she stood close enough to this desk to brush the edge with her sash. He turned to me then, a spark of anticipation alight in his voice. Watson, we are no longer dealing with fire. We are dealing with a match yet to be struck. Holmes's network, like the roots of a tree, extended far beneath the surface of things. It was through one such unseen channel that we were led to a small boarding house in Camden, where a young man by the name of Percival Gillam resided under conditions far beneath his academic promise. He opened the door to us with a kind of cautious hope, the look of someone who had not spoken his mind in some time and dared not believe it might yet be welcomed. I didn't steal anything, he said before Holmes had uttered a word. Holmes raised a hand. We do not accuse, we inquire. There is a difference. Gillam let out a shaky breath and gestured us inside. His room was cramped, its walls pinned with old diagrams of document trees and ink composition charts. I asked questions, he said. That's all. About the sealed cabinet. About the register that didn't match. And Prentice? I asked. He warned me. Kindly, I think. But someone else heard. A week later, I was let go. Conduct unbecoming. That was the phrase. Holmes nodded. Mr. Gillam, conduct unbecoming to institutions of secrecy is often the first sign of conduct befitting truth. The young man's lips twitched in a ghost of a smile. Once we had earned his confidence, Gillam produced a notebook he had kept in defiance of policy, and perhaps, as Holmes later observed, in quiet defiance of fear. Mr. Prentice had begun compiling a new catalogue, he said, but not on the main register. It was kept on onion skin sheets, handwritten, with codes for titles that didn't appear in the public archive. Holmes raised a brow. A catalogue of the forbidden. More than forbidden, Gillam said. Explosive. Things no sane institution would admit to possessing. He flipped to a page filled with narrow writing. Some entries were marked with a circle. Those were the politically sensitive ones. Correspondence involving sitting ministers, records from colonial inquiries, a transcript from the First Yardley Tribunal, although that one I never saw myself. Where was it kept? I asked. In Prentice's coat lining, he replied with a faint smile. Or so the joke went, but mostly in his own hand, in his private drawer, separate even from the rest of the forbidden collection. Holmes accepted the notebook without expression. Why do you think he separated those entries? Gillam hesitated. Because he didn't trust the Athenaeum to keep them sealed, and because he knew some of them might one day need to be found. Or buried, Holmes added, voice low. It was I, and I confess this with a touch of pride, who made the discovery that turned Holmes's still-forming suspicions into certainty. While Holmes spoke further with Gillam in the boarding-house parlour, I remained seated, thumbing through the young man's notebook. I had no great hope of contributing materially to the case, and so the discovery, when it came, startled me as much as it did Holmes. "Holmes," I said, "look here. These two catalogue entries. They refer to the Yardley letters and a certain correspondence from a former colonial governor, but they're not crossed out like the others. They're missing entirely." Holmes turned sharply. "Missing? Not burned," I said. "There's no trace of ash, no charring, just removed, cleanly." Gillam leaned forward. "I'd noticed that too. I thought perhaps Mr. Prentice had refiled them elsewhere." Holmes was silent for a moment, then snapped his fingers. "No, Watson, he didn't refile them. Someone removed them before the fire, intentionally. The fire was a mask, a stage trick. But the theft came first." "And the letters?" I asked. "If they still exist," Holmes murmured, "then someone very powerful wants them kept quiet." And from the narrowing of his eyes, I knew Holmes had already begun to form a plan. In the cab back to Baker Street, Holmes sat in a state of what I can only describe as electrified stillness, a paradox I'd come to associate with the onset of revelation. He spoke only once on the journey, and that was to say, "The Yardley affair has not finished smouldering, Watson. It was merely banked beneath ash." Once home, he spread Gillam's notebook and a handful of Prentice's recovered notes across the table, aligning them with the fastidious care of a man diffusing a device. "The Yardley letters," he said, tapping a space where the missing page had once been. "Long rumoured, allegedly lost in the Indian Rebellion. But no, they were deposited here, quietly, and someone has now reclaimed them." "But who would—" "Someone with access," Holmes replied. "Someone who knew of their existence and feared what they contained. The letters, Watson, if authentic, connect a sitting member of Parliament, one with colonial tenure, to decisions that led to the massacre at Bigha." I blanched. Good heavens, that would be treason. "Wartime decisions," Holmes said with deliberate calm, "are often written in ink and buried in shame. But paper remembers, even when people forget." He paused, then added with a flicker of sardonic humour, "And sometimes it burns." Holmes settled back in his chair, steepling his fingers and fixing his gaze beyond the window, as though the answer lay hidden in the London fog itself. "The fire, Watson, was a misdirection of exquisite subtlety," he said at last. "It was never about destruction. The true crime lies not in what was burned, but what vanished." I frowned. "You mean a theft, then?" "Precisely, but a theft surgical in its precision. The index was a ledger of many thousands of entries, yet only certain pages, those referring to specific political correspondence, have disappeared without trace." Holmes leaned forward, voice lowering to a conspiratorial murmur. "A theft disguised as chaos, the chaotic act of burning to conceal the calculated act of removal." I rubbed my chin, suddenly appreciating the intricacy. So someone knew exactly what to take, and where to hide their hand. Indeed, the faintest trace of smoke is often the best smokescreen, and those who deal in secrets know the value of an ash-covered lie. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a quiet triumph. "It is the absences, Watson, that reveal the true presence of guilt." I felt the familiar chill of awe mixed with the creeping discomfort that accompanied Holmes's revelations. An unsettling reminder that truth often lurks in shadows more than in light. Our inquiries soon led us to a peculiar figure within the Athenaeum staff, a cleaning woman known only as Miss Eliza, mute by birth, and shrouded in an aura of silent vigilance. She moved through the stacks with the quiet determination of one who is both unseen and indispensable. Holmes observed her keenly. "A woman who has nothing to say often hears everything, Watson," he remarked. "Miss Eliza's silence is her fortress and her weapon. Though she spoke no word, she communicated through neatly written notes, delivered with a deftness that belied her humble station." Holmes was quick to note that she was unusually familiar with the most sensitive areas of the Athenaeum, places generally barred to the cleaning staff. She has evaded suspicion through invisibility, Holmes mused one evening, yet in that invisibility lies a wealth of knowledge. A mute shadow can move freely where tongues are shackled. I confessed my unease. And you think she might be involved? Holmes shrugged. Involvement is too crude a term. She may be protector as much as conspirator, guided perhaps by loyalty rather than guile. As we delved deeper, it became clear that Miss Eliza held a role far beyond dust and brooms. The quietest voice, I found, often carried the heaviest burden. That evening at Baker Street, Holmes confided only fragments of his plan, measured words veiled in cryptic intent. "Watson," he said, lighting his pipe, "we are no longer confronting flames, but ink. Forgery, deception, and the subtle art of manipulation." He tapped a ledger on the table. "The fire was a ruse, Watson. The real danger lies in fabricated documents that can rewrite history, alter reputations, and bind the innocent in chains of suspicion." Holmes's eyes glittered with that peculiar thrill I had come to recognize as the prelude to action. "I have set a trap, but it will require patience and silence. The key lies in observing who attempts to verify false records, those who seek to confirm forgeries." I pressed for details, but Holmes merely smiled. "Patience, my dear Watson. The game is already afoot. It is ink, not fire, that will reveal our quarry." Despite my impatience, I trusted his judgment. Holmes, as ever, was the maestro conducting an unseen symphony, his every move designed to draw out the hidden notes of guilt and innocence alike. As the night deepened, I could not help but admire the elegance of his stratagem, a plan so subtle that the very shadows seemed complicit in its execution. Holmes, ever the master of subtle provocations, devised a plan that would appeal precisely to the avarice and caution of our unseen adversary. He arranged for the Athenaeum to receive a donation, not of priceless manuscripts or rare folios, but of fabricated materials, documents forged with such skill as to pass the most casual scrutiny. This donation came purportedly from a fictitious noble lineage, the House of Eldersham, whose dusty reputation lent it a tempting allure. Among the parcels was a letter, artfully penned and bearing the semblance of official correspondence. It alleged the existence of a secret alliance involving the Prime Minister himself, a document destined to set tongues wagging and eyebrows rising in the corridors of power. Holmes's intention was clear: to tempt the thief into acting prematurely. We waited, Holmes's patience as unwavering as the ancient stones beneath the Athenaeum. The trap was baited, the line cast. I confess a mixture of admiration and anxiety. Admiration for Holmes's strategic genius, anxiety for the unknown that prowled in the shadows of that venerable library. As the days wore on, I could sense the mounting tension within Holmes, a quiet electricity that sharpened his senses. The game was set. The thief had little choice but to reveal himself. Under the cloak of night, when even the gas lamps in the surrounding streets burned low or flickered in the chilling breeze, the Athenaeum was not as silent as it appeared. Holmes had informed the night porter to be vigilant, and we ourselves awaited developments in the dimly lit sanctum of 221B. It was in those silent hours that the alarm, a barely perceptible click hidden beneath the shelves, sounded its warning. An unseen figure had entered, stealthily moving among the manuscripts and records. This intruder sought to verify the forged Eldersham identity by cross-referencing the Athenaeum's ledgers. Holmes, having anticipated this move, had stationed himself nearby in disguise. He followed the intruder's trail with the deftness of a bloodhound on the scent. The figure bent over the ledgers, fingers tracing names and dates, unaware that Holmes's keen eyes observed every movement, every hesitation. The night held its breath as the thief searched for confirmation, his anxiety betraying the carefully constructed mask of confidence. It was a moment pregnant with risk and revelation. Holmes's whispered warning was the harbinger of what was to come. Holmes's chosen disguise was that of a foreign academic, a visiting professor from Leipzig, with an air of intellectual authority and an accent just foreign enough to divert suspicion. I confess I was astonished by the conviction with which he assumed this role. As the intruder turned, startled by the sudden presence of the professor, Holmes let slip a few words in heavily accented German, enough to rattle the man's composure. "I am surprised," Holmes began, voice dripping with theatrical surprise, "that one so careful would neglect to check the credentials of a supposed donor." The intruder faltered, and Holmes pressed on with subtle interrogation. To my shock, the man revealed himself not as the mute cleaning woman we had briefly suspected, but as Sir Rowland Kincaid, the formidable head of the Athenaeum's trustees. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I see, Sir Rowland, that you have employed a very effective blind." The tension in the room was palpable. Sir Rowland, caught between rage and calculation, attempted to maintain a veneer of authority, but his facade cracked like old varnish. Holmes had outmaneuvered a master of deception. Sir Rowland's confession unfolded like the turning of a dark, brittle page. He spoke of a past he sought desperately to bury, the years he had spent in colonial service in India, where shadows lengthened beyond the reach of law. "I was not always the man you see before you," Sir Rowland began, his voice low, tinged with bitterness. "During my tenure abroad, I became entangled in dealings that, if exposed, would ruin me utterly." He admitted to having used the threat of exposure to manipulate Prentice, exploiting the archivist's vulnerability, the spectre of an opium relapse that had long haunted him. "The fire," Sir Rowland continued, "was staged to appear as an accident, or worse, the act of a troubled man, but it served to erase only what implicated me." Holmes listened with his usual inscrutable expression, then interjected. "And the Yardley letters?" Sir Rowland's eyes darkened. "Those letters would have undone not only me, but many others. That is why they were taken. The destruction of the index was merely the stage upon which the real crime was performed." I found myself unable to conceal my astonishment at the depth of the intrigue, the quiet wars waged in the shadows of power and parchment. Holmes rose, folding his hands. "We have unearthed a tangled web, but the threads are now in our hands." Sir Rowland's fate, I realised, was sealed, not by fire, but by the resolute intellect of my remarkable friend. Holmes, with his habitual calm, reached into the pocket of Mr. Prentice's overcoat and drew out a small, carefully folded bundle of papers. "Gentlemen," he announced, "I believe I have located what the fire could not consume." The bundle, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, was indeed remarkable. Holmes unfolded it with the care of a surgeon, revealing a set of aged documents, yellowed but impeccably preserved. They were the Yardley letters, the very correspondence that had been the fulcrum of this entire investigation. "How," I whispered, "did you suspect such a hiding place?" Holmes smiled faintly. Mr. Prentice's coat exhibited a peculiar stiffness and a faint bulge along the lining. I suspected he had taken extraordinary measures to protect his most dangerous secrets. No fire, however fierce, can reach silk-lined pockets hidden from the common eye. Sir Rowland's face paled as the letters were laid bare. His plans, his fears, all were now painfully tangible. Holmes's eyes scanned the documents briefly, then locked onto mine. This is the truth they sought to bury. Prentice, for the first time since his arrival, seemed to relax, the burden of concealment lifting even as the danger grew. In that moment, the library's silent walls seemed to hold their breath, as if awaiting the next act in this quiet but relentless drama. The revelation of the letters was only half the story. Holmes had saved his most astonishing discovery for last. The mute cleaning woman, hitherto a shadow moving unnoticed through the Athenaeum's aisles, was not what she appeared. Holmes confronted her with a mixture of quiet respect and mild amusement. "Miss Eliza," he began gently, You have served as both guardian and deceiver. Pray, explain yourself." Through carefully penned notes, the woman revealed her true identity. She was none other than Thaddeus Prentice's niece, having taken up her position in the library to shield her uncle from prying eyes and to confound those who would harm him. Holmes nodded approvingly. A most commendable ruse. The silence of one who hears much is often louder than words. Her presence had been a barrier to Sir Rowland's machinations, a living safeguard placed precisely where suspicion might least fall. I confess I was moved by the quiet courage this revealed, a loyalty beyond words, stronger than many proclamations. Holmes, ever the detached observer, remarked only that, in the theatre of shadows, sometimes the smallest figure cast the longest silhouette. The niece's intervention had turned the tide of the case, though none could say yet if it was for justice or mercy. Holmes gathered us once more at Baker Street, his manner grave, yet tinged with that unmistakable air of triumph. The fire, he stated, was but theatre, a spectacle designed to distract and deceive. The true crime was concealed in silken ink, not ash and flame. The scandal, buried deep within the stitched lining of an overcoat, had eluded destruction. Justice, Holmes mused, does not always require the clang of courtroom bells or the glare of public scrutiny. Sometimes it is served quietly, beneath the surface, through careful observation and timely intervention. I found myself reflecting on the fragility of truth, how easily it may be manipulated, hidden, or lost. Holmes's voice softened, almost poetically. Knowledge is a double-edged sword, Watson. It can liberate or destroy, and often the most potent weapon is silence. As we pondered this, a letter arrived bearing a seal unfamiliar to either of us. Holmes regarded it with a raised eyebrow and a sly smile. "Ah, Watson, another case perhaps. Ink, scandal, smoke, and the eternal dance between them." I could only smile in return, grateful as ever to be the companion in such enigmatic pursuits. Returning to the familiar confines of Baker Street, Holmes set about unravelling the tangled threads of our case with the meticulous precision that never failed to astonish me. He began with a small soot-streaked handkerchief that Prentice had inadvertently left behind, holding it up to the gaslight as if it were a priceless gem. "Observe, Watson," Holmes instructed, "the absence of burns upon these fingers. A man who set fire to a document would bear the marks upon his skin, yet Prentice remains unscathed. His hands betray no evidence of flame." He then held up the overcoat, indicating the brass button with its melted and pitted surface. "This, my dear fellow, speaks not of ordinary fire, but chemical accelerants designed to burn swiftly and cleanly, leaving little trace but a whisper of heat." Holmes's gaze settled upon Prentice's sleeve. And this tremor, a residue of an opium relapse concealed beneath the stiff willpower of the man himself, a sign that he was coerced rather than complicit. I listened, rapt, as Holmes reconstructed the scene, the staged fire, the careful extraction of select pages, the subtle manipulation of evidence designed to implicate the wrong man. It was a frame, Watson, a play of smoke and mirrors to cloak a far more sinister theft. The true crime lies not in the destruction of property, but in the erasure of inconvenient truths. With the pieces assembled, Holmes looked up, his sharp eyes gleaming. "The catalogue has been rebuilt from ash and ink, but the truth endures." Holmes's deductions grew more intimate as he delved into the finer details of Prentice's condition and habits. "The man's hands," he began, "are unburned, yet marked by a tremor. This is no ordinary quiver, Watson, but the telltale sign of opium's lingering grasp." I observed the slight trembling of Prentice's left hand as Holmes spoke, the archivist's eyes darkening with shame. "His attire," Holmes continued, "carries the faint dusting of chalk upon his boots, a sign of recent passage through stone corridors, likely the renovated sections of the Athenaeum. The pitted brass button on his coat, melted not by open flame, but by a chemical fire accelerant, suggests close proximity to a carefully controlled fire. Holmes paced the room, each step measured before turning to me with that rare smile. All these clues tell a story of coercion rather than guilt, Watson. Our client was manipulated, his mind shadowed by substance and fear, rendered a pawn in a larger game. He concluded, such physical signs, when pieced together, reveal the truth that words alone would obscure. They are the margin notes to a narrative written in secrecy and betrayal. I marvelled at Holmes's ability to read flesh and habit as though they were pages in a book, and wondered anew at the depths to which his intellect could plunge. Holmes then turned to the ledger, its pages whispering secrets of their own. Sir Rowland Kincaid, aware of the precariousness of his position, resorted to coded entries within the Athenaeum's borrowing records. These were his clandestine instructions to the conspirators, masked as innocent annotations. He explained how the forged handwriting in the ledger was no mere imitation, but a deliberate cipher designed to convey orders while eluding suspicion. Such deception, Holmes mused, is the art of the forger, a delicate dance of imitation and concealment. The records gave an appearance of legitimacy to the unauthorized movements within the library. I realized that this web of deceit extended far beyond a simple theft. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign to manipulate history itself. By exploiting the very mechanisms of trust, Holmes continued, Sir Rowland sought to erase inconvenient truths while maintaining the veneer of propriety. He tapped a finger against the table thoughtfully. It is an ingenious scheme, Watson, and one that nearly succeeded in its silence. His eyes sparkled with satisfaction. But the cleverest forgers leave their telltale slips, clues woven into the fabric of their lies, and it is our duty to unravel them. Holmes's final revelation concerned the nature of the fire itself. This was never about destruction in the common sense, Watson, he declared. The fire was a controlled blaze, precise, deliberate, surgical. He detailed how the charred drawer bore the marks of a chemical accelerant, one which burns fiercely yet leaves minimal trace beyond the immediate point of combustion. The goal, Holmes explained, was not the complete eradication of evidence, but the concealment of specific documents. Those incriminating pages were removed in advance, leaving behind a staged scene of destruction intended to mislead. Holmes reflected on the psychological intent behind such a display. By simulating madness or accident, the perpetrators sought to divert suspicion onto Prentice, whose frailty was well known. He mused on the implications. To erase a truth is often more powerful than to write a lie, for it breeds uncertainty and forgetfulness. I found myself contemplating how carefully orchestrated acts of deception could alter the course of justice. Holmes concluded with a wry smile. In this case, fire was but a curtain, and behind it lay a far more intricate performance of ink and intent. I must confess to a measure of indignation when Holmes, with a certain amused detachment, admitted that much of his plan had been concealed even from me. After all, as his constant companion and chronicler, I had hoped for a fuller share in the stratagems. Holmes, I protested, surely it would have been better to have trusted me with the entire truth, to keep me in the confidence of your designs. He regarded me with an arch smile, the kind that always reminded me of a cat amused by the antics of an eager mouse. My dear Watson, he replied dryly, had I revealed the whole plan at once, your expression of horror might have ruined everything. Besides, he paused, tapping a finger beneath his curled moustache, your whiskers are far too honest for the art of espionage. They would give you away every time. I could not help but chuckle at his wit, but the sting of exclusion remained. Yet, in that moment, I realized the depths of Holmes's caution, and his understanding of the limitations not only of others, but of myself. Very well, Holmes, I conceded, but promise me you will one day reveal the full tale. He only smiled. When the time is right, my friend, when the time is right. As the evening deepened and the last embers in the fireplace flickered low, Holmes and I settled into the quiet reflection that follows the climax of any investigation. The case of the burned index, Holmes mused, is not merely one of theft or arson, but of knowledge that can be both weapon and shield. I nodded slowly. Truth, once recorded, gains a power far beyond the immediate. It can liberate, condemn, or corrupt. Precisely, Holmes said. Sometimes the destruction of a document is more potent than the act of writing one. To erase memory is to shape history itself. He tapped a slender finger against his chin. Silence, Watson, is often the most formidable adversary to justice. It preserves secrets better than any lock or ledger. I found myself pondering the paradox that the pursuit of truth often requires navigating through veils of silence and deception. Holmes looked at me with a rare softness. Our task is to pierce those veils, no matter the cost. And with that, the game ended for now, leaving us both to consider how fragile the balance between knowledge and ignorance truly remains. It was nearly a week later when I found Holmes alone in his sitting room, crouched over a small pile of charred fragments. His fingers moved with the utmost delicacy, as if handling something far more precious than mere ash and paper. "Still at your puzzle, Holmes?" I asked, approaching quietly. He looked up, eyes gleaming with that peculiar light of intellectual pleasure. "Indeed, Watson, while the case may be resolved, the temptation to untangle disorder remains irresistible. The charred edges tell stories that even fire cannot fully silence." He lifted a tiny scrap and held it to the lamplight, tracing invisible lines with a fingernail. "Here is the essence of curiosity, the desire to reconstruct chaos and find pattern where others see only ruin. This," he said with a quiet smile, "is the true delight of the detective's art." I sat beside him, feeling the familiar surge of admiration, mixed with that humble recognition that Holmes's mind moved in realms I could only glimpse. Even amid stashes, there was a story waiting to be told, a final whisper from the shadows of the case. Holmes reclined in his chair, his gaze distant as he pondered aloud. "History, Watson, is seldom the simple record of events. It is a tapestry woven from what survives. Papers, memories, whispers." I nodded, understanding his meaning. "Much is lost," he continued, "either by accident or design. Entire chapters are erased not by ink, but by silence. Sometimes the absence of truth is more potent than its presence." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the armrest. "The most dangerous legacy is not scandal or deceit, but the things that were never recorded. Secrets buried so deep that even time forgets them." Holmes regarded me with a faint smile. "And so it is the detective's task to unearth those memories, to speak for the unsaid, and to challenge the comfortable narratives that the world prefers." His words hung in the air, like a solemn charge, reminding me anew of the delicate balance between knowledge and oblivion. In that moment, I glimpsed the quiet poetry beneath Holmes's unyielding logic, a respect for truth that transcended even the most tangled mysteries. Our quiet contemplation was interrupted by a knock at the door, followed by the arrival of a curious letter, its seal unfamiliar and intriguing. Holmes took it from my hand, breaking the wax with deliberate care. The crest, a stylized lion entwined with an ivy wreath, was unlike any I'd seen in the annals of London's nobility. He studied the letter with an expression that mingled amusement and anticipation. "Watson," he said, a spark lighting his eye, "it seems the wheels of mystery never cease their turning. A new case is already knocking at our door, dressed in ink and sealed with enigma." I could not help but smile at the familiar thrill that always accompanied Holmes's encounters with the unknown. "Another dance with shadows," Holmes mused. "And who are we to refuse the invitation?" With an arched brow, and a slight curl of his lip, Holmes rose from his chair, stretching as if to shake off the last traces of the old case. "Come, Watson," he said, slipping on his coat with an air of ready purpose. "One enigma closes in smoke, but another begins anew with ink." I followed, heart lightened by the prospect of the next pursuit, a mind already racing to keep pace with the incomparable detective. As we stepped into the London mist once more, I reflected on the endless dance between light and shadow, truth and deception, and the singular joy of walking that line beside Holmes. "After all," he quipped, "the game is never truly over." And with that, we vanished into the night, eager for the mysteries yet to come. As Holmes settled back into his chair, the faintest trace of a smile touched his lips. "Watson, it is curious how often the most dangerous weapon is not steel or poison, but the quiet erasure of truth. In this case, the flames were but a curtain hiding a far more insidious theft, the theft of memory itself." He paused, eyes glinting. One wonders, what was the criminal's greatest mistake? Was it the burning of papers or the underestimation of subtle observation? Now, I invite you, what do you believe was the turning point that led to the unravelling of this mystery? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this tale of smoke and secrets, please subscribe for more adventures with Holmes, and do share this story with friends who love a good mystery.